It's a really interesting question. And people sometimes say like, hey, can't I learn how to do X for free online? Absolutely, you can. You can learn to do anything. What schools are for are to help you know the best path to take, to help you speed up that process. And then look, the answer to every question that you ask is in Google it. That wouldn't, um, you should try to Google it first. And if you're still confused and stuck, you use AI or human or whatever.
Hey Austin, how are you doing well?
Yeah, thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, I've been eyeing this for a very, very long time. If I ask you, who are you?
Yeah. Thanks. My name is Austen. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the Bloom Institute of Technology. We train people to be software engineers and data scientists, and try to do so in a way that where it doesn't work out for somebody, they don't have to pay us anything. So that's the hallmark of what we try to do. And I've been relatively successful in doing so. There are thousands of engineers all over the world and Silicon Valley who are trained by us. Pretty much every major tech company you can think of, we've got BloomTech grads there. So that's me.
And you moved to San Francisco after you learned how to code. You moved to San Francisco and started working at company.
Yeah.
How much role did that play in starting doing things?
I think it was huge. And I don't spend all of my time in San Francisco now. I'm still in San Francisco a lot of the time today. But I think, originally, when I was a lot younger, I went to this conference with a NASA astronaut, and somebody asked them, how they became an astronaut, and their advice was, find the most exciting place in the world to you, and they didn't mean geographically, just and get into the middle of it, whatever it takes. Go get in the very center. And so I've thought about that a lot over the years. I've lived in a lot of different places, and so when I was in college, in Utah, in Provo, Utah, and I felt like there was this really exciting stuff going on, and I was missing it. Utah has its own tech scene, and I don't want to dismiss that or pretend like it's not real. But as I looked at everything that I felt was super exciting, it was all in Silicon Valley. So I didn't have any money at the time. I had a few $100s is all, which doesn't even cover a month of rent in the Bay Area. But I found a blog post by this guy he was a designer, and he had moved out to Silicon Valley, and he just lived in his car, and while he found a job, his entire goal was just to find a job. And I realized that we had the exact same make and model of car. We both had 2-door Honda Civics. So like, oh, actually, I could do that. So I just drove out to Silicon Valley. I didn't even, once you get out to Silicon Valley, you realize it's not like Wall Street, where there's a street and there's, a lot of stuff happening around Wall Street. The reality in Silicon Valley is most everybody is in offices, working, and there's not really a place to go. So I just drove out there, started sleeping on random streets in Palo Alto, hoping nobody would notice me. I got a low income membership at the YMCA on Ross Road. So that's where I would go shower. And there was a co-working space that you could have 24/7 access to called the Hacker Dojo. They've moved a few times, but it's still around. So I would, go work all day in the Hacker Dojo and then go sleep in my car, and needed getting a shower, I would go to the YMCA, and it'd be like a bunch of 60-year-old Asian people playing basketball, and me, the random quasi-homeless guy. So yeah, while I was there, I taught myself to code, started meeting people, and later on I started working for a company in San Francisco that was backed by Y Combinator, and started meeting people that way. And then eventually we're in Y Combinator, and I think it is actually very important in Silicon Valley, and not just the geographic Silicon Valley, but metaphysical Silicon Valley. Working in tech, it is extremely impactful to meet people. And even, just yesterday, I randomly called somebody that I had met when we were both in a Y Combinator growth thing, and got some of the best insight you could ever get. And I think he might be the only person in the world who could have helped me understand that particular thing. So I don't spend all my time in the Bay Area now, but I think it was very important to the company that I was in the Bay Area to meet people and to, start out, I guess.
What do you think, both, I'm referring to both the geography and the metaphorical Silicon Valley, what do you think makes it special for founders and for people who want to build?
Yeah, this is something that I found difficult to describe and to, even, so to speak, to price into where you want to live, because I do think obviously the world is becoming more, especially, post-COVID, remote is more accepted, and you can still have access to people. And before, in like 2015, 2016, there was Skype, but it was rare to jump on a Skype call with people, and a little bit weird. Like, you wouldn't, certainly when we were starting the company, every meeting was in person. Doing something via Zoom was pretty rare. Now it's much more common, to the extent that, when I talk to people, I don't even necessarily know where they're geographically located. And even if you're on different sides of San Francisco, you might jump on a Zoom instead of meeting in person if it's a quick meeting. Because I spent a whole lot of time in the early days of the company jumping around on Ubers and BART and, whatever muni where it took a lot of time to get around. In the Bay Area, from the south tip of Palo Alto to San Francisco to the East Bay, this is very, very geographically spread apart. It can be hours away. But I found that, and when COVID hit, we moved out. We originally went out to Utah for the weekend, and then we basically just didn't go back. As COVID became 2 weeks to slow the spread to 2 years of nobody meeting up in person, and San Francisco was locked down, and having 3 kids in a very small San Francisco apartment doesn't work super well when all the parks are closed and all the beaches are closed and all that stuff. So we tended to stay in Utah. But I found that, when stuff started opening back up, even though Utah is not very far away, it's a pretty quick flight. There were, when people are getting together for dinner, you don't get invited anymore. When there's a random meetup happening tonight, even though you're not very far away, you're not going to jump on a plane for, drive to the airport, wait an hour for security, drive an hour, fly an hour and a half to San Francisco, and then drive another hour to get to the venue. That's your whole day. So the little connections that you make become really important. And I think when people talk about that, others assume that they mean, for doing big deals or for fundraising. It's really not that. It's a network of really subtle advice and practice that you learn by being around those in the industry that do what they do really, really well. As well as another aspect that I think is underrated is just the energy of everybody being in a similar state of mind, everybody working in tech, everybody thinking optimistically about the future and thinking that tech is a way to solve those problems. It's very, very different than when, there are times when I'm in Utah and I'm talking to our neighbors, and I work with computers, and that's like, oh, cool. That, I can't relate to that at all, which sometimes is relieving, but sometimes it's really good to be around like-minded people.
I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but in like the 1950s, the government allowed pension funds to invest in venture capital funds. And I think from the startup ecosystem really took off and the whole bay. Is that wrong?
Yes, I think there are a couple. There probably was this magic mix of, in my mind, three specific things that made Silicon Valley Silicon Valley. And the first was, if you go to even today in Silicon Valley, there is that's where a lot of weapons and defense manufacturing, and not manufacturing so much as hardcore engineering talent. The NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory is there, the Eames Research Lab, Xerox PARC. So it was this, if you were in Silicon Valley in the 60s, it was normal for everybody to be an engineer, or for a lot of people to be engineers. And it might be a handful of engineers surrounded by empty fields, which is unimaginable today outside of Stanford's little area that they're not building anything on. Everywhere else, it's among the most expensive real estate in the world. But you had kind of a base of a whole lot of engineers, and that's one. And that came from defense spending. That was, government, generally speaking, that was a lot of government spending, government investment in research and technology. And part of the reason that was happening in what we now know as Silicon Valley is because Stanford was right there. So, one of the best research institutions, especially in science and technology in the world. And then you have the venture capital that starts to flow in. So, it's not, venture capital was pretty rare in the early days. I mean, if we're talking 60s and 70s, Apple was a little bit of an anomaly. There's a lot of money flowing in, but nothing compared to what we know today. And then kind of the fourth and almost the trunk, and I should say Berkeley is there as well. So you have both Stanford and Berkeley, which are both, very highly regarded engineering, training, science and technology research institutions in a pretty small geographical area. And then the fourth is the weather is nice enough that everybody, and it's beautiful and you can do everything there. So it's not hard to convince people to stay. And that, you can joke about whether that's a more important or less important part of it. But even if you look at, Andy Grove talks about, he originally, when he immigrated to the US, he moved into New York and he hated it. And then when he got out in Silicon Valley, he was like, oh, this place is beautiful. I'm going to stay here. And yes, there are a handful of the pioneers of the industry that were there because of that. And so, it's a weird geographic mix of defense spending and free-spirited hippies and investment funds coming in and a lot of engineers and a really beautiful area. And you end up just with this crazy centralized wealth building, unlike I think it's hard to find a comparable time. And then slowly over time that moved up into San Francisco. That kind of happened in, I'd say like the 2000s, the early 2000s. The epicenter of Silicon Valley started moving from, really Palo Alto, Stanford up to San Francisco. And now it's, there are parts in San Francisco called Hayes Valley, and they're trying to rebrand as Cerebral Valley and say that that's the AI focused area. And there are incredible parts of San Francisco, and there are parts of San Francisco that are falling apart. And there are, for a while there, companies were starting to move out to the East Bay and Oakland because it's so much cheaper. So it's, and COVID happened at the same time.
Can the environment that San Francisco has created, can it be replicated in other parts of the world? That quality?
Yeah, I think, like a lot of things that happen historically, the things that sound like it aren't going to be exactly the same. I think probably the closest to what that has been like, and it's probably Bangalore, I would say, or India has its own thriving startup ecosystem. And when we talk about how difficult it is to get across San Francisco and how spread out San Francisco is, Bangalore has its own traffic and geography spread issues. Bangalore is enormous, right? San Francisco itself is tiny. San Francisco Bay Area is it's bigger. But yeah, I think, and then I think there's also an element of, and this is true in what you find in a lot of startups, that the number one accrues so much of the benefit, right? The number one social network, the number one streaming platform, the number one you have this compounding network effect, and so that's really hard to recreate because there is San Francisco. So if anybody is making a decision, let's say somebody has an unlimited passport and they can work anywhere in the world, they have to explicitly decide not San Francisco for a tech company. And enough people have to do that, then it becomes its own thing. So I think it would take a lot for San Francisco to fully fall off the map. They've been trying. The government's doing everything it can to make it harder to live in San Francisco. But yeah, I think it's difficult to recreate all of those. You'll have smaller, more. When I talk to people in Utah and they try to brand Utah as Silicon Slopes and say, we're the next best thing, in my mind, coming from like a branding and marketing standpoint, if you're naming yourself after the big thing to say that you're just as good, everybody knows that you're tacitly admitting that you wish that you were the big thing. So I think it would be better for a lot of other places to find their own niche. So Utah, as an example, is really good at sales, and not as strong at product or research or deep engineering. And if I were Utah, if I were making the decision for how Utah is going to brand itself, I would start saying like, hey, sales is what happens in Utah. Like tech sales, we're the best in the world at tech sales. And I think Bangalore is fighting we're Silicon Valley but cheap mantra, which isn't even true a lot of the time. There are very expensive engineers in Bangalore as well, but it becomes a difficult square to circle. I think Elon starting to push stuff into Texas could move the needle, but it takes a really long time.
But on the same point, you moved to San Francisco. It was a home for a while. So you learned to code. How did you really learn to code now that you teach it to so many people?
Yeah, I mean, I would not. You should look at my example as a lot of things to not do. And one of the reasons, like I consider myself a self-taught engineer, but in retrospect, it probably would have been way easier and way faster if I had gone to some sort of school for it. Because if you're to look like what's the best place to learn to code right now, what you end up having is a bunch of really opinionated engineers who don't even remember what it's like to learn to code, saying you should do exactly what I do today. So I started and stopped 80 different times with so many different languages, and you like run into you start and you're going really well, and then you run into an issue that you can't solve, and it can be really dumb. It could be your environment isn't working correctly, or it could be there's this bug, or there's this fundamental thing I don't understand. And theoretically, there are all these you can go on Reddit or IRC. It was IRC channels at the time, and maybe Discords or Slacks now, or Stack Overflow, and you can, slowly you can get yelled at for asking a question that's already been asked, even though you're asking a different question. But it was hard. So and what people who are self-teaching to become engineers often do is they go 30% of the way on one path and they hit some roadblock of, there's a question they can't solve or there's something they don't understand. And instead of figuring it out and powering it through, and I'm using they inclusive of me, will kind of start over on a completely different path. And so you get caught in this kind of tutorial hell of, you've done the first third of learning how to be an engineer 87 times before you actually power through and start to figure stuff out. So yeah, I mean, I built BloomTech to be what I wish that I would have had when I was on that journey. Every time I'm building something in BloomTech, I'm thinking like, would I like this? Is that what I wanted? And sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's bad, because you end up biased to what your individual preferences are instead of other people's. But I think it's a pretty good starting that way. It gets you 95% of the way there. So it worked pretty well.
How much of like to your last point, how much of what everyone learns is in a pattern similar versus how much of it is very different?
Yeah, I think I think we overcomplicate that sometimes. I mean, there have been these apocryphal stories of, this person learns auditorially, this person learns through video, this person learns through, like, all the studies that I can find say that actually has pretty minimal effect. I think that's, that kind of got into the broader conscious in a way that is overrepresented versus what the delta actually is. What matters most at the end of the day is two things. One is how much time you're spending. So the amount of, I call it, fingers on keyboard time you spend writing code. And I specifically point that out because you can watch videos endlessly. You can watch 87 hours of YouTube tutorials of somebody else solving a problem, and you still won't really understand it until you're actually trying to solve that problem yourself. And the next most important thing is what happens when you're stuck, when there's something you don't understand, when there's something that doesn't click. We have our own AI, the BloomTech Bear. His name is Barry. You could ask him pretty much anything. He understands all of our curriculum. He understands what you do and don't know within the course. He even is starting to understand some of the if you have a question about tuition or hours or getting support, he's starting to understand even that stuff. And he's available 24/7, and he's infinitely compassionate, and he will, and we still have humans on the other side that watch what how he responds to stuff and make sure that it's accurate and he's not hallucinating. And if there's something that he can't answer, there's still humans there. But he's built into our Slack even now. So you can just be like, hey, Barry, I don't understand this. Explain it. I would have chilled for that when I was in that spot. Then the most important things are hours spent and how you get unstuck.
How would you deal with a problem where you're stuck with? I mean, I noticed that when there's a tough part and people do get stuck, try to procrastinate on that, and for the fear that they have in mind that their internal ego will get hurt if they are not able to do that. How do you deal with when you're stuck and get out of the track?
Yeah, I think that's one of the more important questions that you can ask, because, and I mean that in a very broad sense. Sometimes, the questions that I ask today aren't always technical in nature, right? So sometimes the answer is subtle or multivariate, or there are a bunch of different ways that you can solve something and you're looking for the best solution, or, you need to figure out who is the best person for X, and there are 7 different people, or that kind of thing. But it's funny. I distinctly remember a point where I was used to before I was teaching myself the code, I would stumble upon something and realize that it required a technical solution using something that I didn't understand or know how to use. And there was a very clear one specific instance where I came across a problem and I said, okay, I don't know how to do that. I'm not an engineer. And then, like, in the back of my mind, there's just something that said, well, what if you just tried to figure it out, right? What if, I know you're not you may not be an engineer, but what if you Googled around and tried copying, pasting code, or tried to like research enough to understand what's happening and solve the problem? And, I did it. I eventually, figured out enough of the stuff to be able to solve that. And at that point, it really, like, I didn't call myself a software engineer at that point, but I think that's when I discovered what software engineering actually is, because what the day-to-day of a software engineer is like is, you have to write a little bit of code that you look at the problem and you know exactly how to solve it. But where the bulk of time and effort and energy in software engineering is spent is when there's a new challenge. You don't totally know how to solve it. You don't know what the right answer is. And you're researching and trying things and figuring out how to solve that particular problem. It's surprising to me how much that has unlocked in my life. Just when you come upon something you don't understand, not letting that stop you, just using your agency and going forward and figuring it out.
I think this is very fair. I mean, you're a founder. You built Bloom from the start. There must have been parts where you didn't know what to do, and you was your.
Yeah, I mean, when we were getting started, I had no idea what I was doing often, and I still have, there are often times that I don't know how to solve something. If I knew how to solve something, I would have already solved it, right? So the vast majority of being a founder is figuring out how to learn new things and solve new problems. And the rate at which you learn those things instead of remain stuck on the same issue and challenge that you had yesterday is probably the most important thing at a startup.
When you're learning new things, even as a founder, how do you go about structuring how to go? I mean, where to start?
Yeah, I usually start Googling something, or more often now using Perplexity to ask and see what the answer is. And then if I can't figure it out that way, I'll ask the people that are easy for me to access, employees and coworkers and investors. And then if there's really something that I can't figure out, I'll tweet about it and throw it out there to the open internet. And that's one of the powerful things about Silicon Valley and Twitter is I can get to the expert in something very quickly, and usually, 99% of the time for free. That spirit of Silicon Valley is really important. People are willing to help, and that goes both ways. I'm more than willing to help a founder who has a problem that I've been through, because I've seen this before. Y Combinator has forums where you can ask questions. You can email people. I have a set of investors that I go to often with my most important questions. Then there are investors that I, very specialized. We have some advisors of the company, but those are very, I would say very narrow. Like, as an example, we have one advisor who helps with very esoteric accounting questions. So when I say, hey, how would GAAP treat an ISA where XYZ, we can go to them and ask those questions. But for the bulk of it, it's just the people that you're surrounded by.
So you do is you basically collect information and piece it to build up the puzzle in your brain, and when the puzzle gets over, you learn. But what do you think is the difference between learning and education then?
I don't think there's a huge difference, honestly. What a good education should do is set up a series of questions that you need to learn how to answer. And that's one of the things that's most interesting about, running a school is every once in a while we get people who have had a very different experience with the education system, to where, if they say, hey, how do I write a for loop? And we'll have a, paid learning assistant or instructor, and their answer is try Googling it. And someone gets really mad. They're like, I'm paying you money. You should tell me how to solve this problem. I was like, no, part of solving the problem is like using Google to learn how to do it. I can do it. I know how to write a for loop. And I can tell you how to do a for loop. But the best way for me to tell you how to do a for loop is to tell you how to be able to learn to use write a for loop without me. And so there's a delicate balance between, and we have to train our AI a little bit differently than other companies might, because the goal is not to just give you the answer. The goal is to help you understand on your own how to come to the answer, because I may not always be there. But learning self-sufficiency is one of the more important aspects of what a great education should give you. And where I see education fall down is it doesn't teach you how to do that. It just gives you all the answers. If it's a bunch of rote memorization, that'll help you memorize those specific things on that specific time, but it doesn't help you problem solve. And most of the learning that you need to do in the world is actually problem solving, not memorization.
But then, I mean, why is it? Why do schools why are schools to help in and making you memorize stuff then?
It's a really interesting question. And people sometimes say like, hey, can't I learn how to do X for free online? Absolutely, you can. You can learn to do anything. What schools are for are to help you know the best path to take, to help you speed up that process. And look, the answer to every question that you ask isn't Google it. That wouldn't, you should try to Google it first. And if you're so confused and stuck, you use AI or human or whatever. But yeah, I think schools exist in the same way, like, when I work out, I have a personal trainer, right? I don't have a trainer because there's no way to figure out how to lift weights on the internet. It's like I'm sure I could find a YouTube video right now that would, tell me one way that you can lift weights. But I still use a trainer because it's personalized to me. It does, and they do enough of the work to speed things up. So, one example that I think about, when we had a student in the early days who was debating whether or not to go to BloomTech or be self-taught, and just figure it out on their own. So, it's not worth this money to go to the school. And I get that. I respect that. I'm self-taught myself, right? And 2.5 years later, that person came back and said, hey, I went the self-taught route. I figured it all out myself, and I got a job, and I didn't need BloomTech after all. And like, yeah, that's awesome. But like, I think if you would have used BloomTech, we could have gotten you there in 6 months instead of 2.5 years, and you would have made a couple $100,000 in income as a result that would have easily paid for the school. So, I have nothing but respect for people who are self-learning and using free resources. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Schools should exist to give you the best path possible and help you get through it as best and as quickly as possible. And that's, another example is, I went to a little bit of college, and in that college that I went to, I took a Shakespeare class. Is there anything that I encountered in that classroom that no one has said about Shakespeare in an accessible way online? No. Would I have learned the same amount about Shakespeare and read the same books and have the same discussions if I were like, hey, I'm going to self-teach Shakespeare? No. So what you should look at is, what is the net delta in your own ability, you as a human, in one path versus another? Not like, is there a curriculum for X? Because there have been textbooks in libraries for free since you and I have been born, for sure. You could learn anything there is to learn. You could find a book on it, for sure. But is doing that the best, most efficient way? Probably not.
Is the curriculum really important in you?
So I think about, what makes a school, right? It is a curriculum and, instructional design to get you to a specific endpoint. Even, if you say I'm going to learn to code, buy a book on JavaScript, you would have to buy 17 different books and learn, how do you know what in those different books you need to learn? And there are good resources out there for learning to code. And people that try to put together curricula out there. So it's very important, but I don't think that BloomTech is successful because there are no other curricula out there. The reason that schools are valuable is because they give you the right mix of curriculum, accountability, support, guidance. It's kind of all of those things together in one package that accelerates things. And the honest reality is, for probably 90% of our students, the choice isn't actually learning to code via BloomTech or learning to code self-taught. It's actually learning to code via BloomTech or giving up and becoming frustrated and not being successful.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about the success of schools. There are a lot of people there are a lot of alternatives that are popping up this school. I mean, a lot of them are successful, a lot of them are not successful, depend on it. But if the schools are so good, then why do you think that people are coming up with alternatives?
I think schools have different goals and structures, and I went to college at BYU. BYU is like, they have curriculum, they have professors, they have grades. Like, there's nothing deficient in what BYU does, but it wasn't taking me on the path that I wanted to go down. Even if I were to study computer science at BYU, I think of it taking me a lot longer to learn to code than it needed to. But I was still way faster than, going to a 4-year university, because I was actually focused on the things that I wanted to be focused on. So I think, and the average computer science education today is, there are a few exceptions to this, but it's very, very, like, even the name computer science shows you that they're trying to, like, you try to make something that's extremely academic when you're calling it science, right? Like, the purpose is research and discovery, not like, let's figure out how to build things efficiently and well. So it's a lot of math, a lot of underlying fundamentals, but not as much practical application, not as much learning how to build with the team, stuff like stuff like that really, really matters. So our education just is fundamentally designed to serve a different purpose than other stuff.
Do you think everything that is learned has to have a practical application?
I think if and there are people for whom BloomTech is not the right fit, right? If you want to be an academic researcher on, discovering new algorithms and new things about computer science that had never been discovered before, we are not the right fit for that. We're not going to teach you how to do that. We're going to teach you how to write great software within an organization and build things.
How do you think that niching down helped BloomTech?
Even when we got started, there's a temptation to say, oh, maybe we'll just teach. Like most people, the education that most people have received in life has been so broad that it tries to do a little bit of everything, right? Like if I went to, at least in the United States, if I went to a university right now, I have to have 2 full years of general studies, right? And, the general studies would be a little bit of math, a little bit of reading, some history, stuff like that. And so people, you could come to BloomTech and say, why don't you teach me that as well? And the answer is we want to be laser focused on our purpose and what we are here for. So if you want to, learn more about World War II, we're not the place to go. We are the place to go specifically if you want to learn how to get a job within technology. That's what we are built for. Everything that we do, and the job part really matters, right? There are other places you can learn about interesting new tech that do not, they're not trying to train you for the workforce. We are trying to help you get the best job we can get. And that's all that we do. So we try to keep our blinders on to that and not get distracted by any of the other stuff. We could design 2 more years of ancillary curriculum and force everybody to go through it. And there might be some benefit there, but we try to maximize the amount of benefit for the amount of time that we require. In education, that's probably the most important aspect of running the school, is having student expectations be exactly aligned with what the school is providing. So if it's 80% of the way there, it's a little bit frustrating. A lot of universities, the thing that people are going to the university for, if you talk to the university says, no, we specifically do not do that thing. That's not a great position to be in. So I've had, university presidents call me in and say, hey, we have these 5 departments where, people are going to that department, they're studying within that department, they come out and they can't make anything, they make less actually than people coming directly out of high school and getting jobs make. We need to fix that. And my initial instinct is, well, can you either tell the students that are coming in that if they study that thing, they won't get a job? Or like, no, because if we do that, then nobody comes in there, and we still have tenured faculty. We have to pay a fortune to teach those classes, and like the school would lose a bunch of money. So yeah, they're like, can we layer on some? Maybe we'll teach students that thing, and then we'll sneak in a little bit of your data science program, so they're actually employable on the other side. And it's like, that's so weird. Just figure out who you are and own it. Don't try to do 2 things at once. And maybe that's the right solution.
You guys got that right. You guys got the niching down and specializing thing right. What do you think is your personal secret, sort of, that you think no one knows, but that you would be willing to share in public? What found this?
I think there's so many but there are a lot of things that I believe deeply that are not publicly agreed upon. I do share most of them publicly just because that's kind of not a very private person. But within education, within education specifically, I think one of the biggest things is understanding the risk that people are taking on. So if I go to a school, what is it going to mean financially for me if it doesn't work out is probably the biggest thing that people are trying to answer. And we've had a lot of students in the past who have come through BloomTech and it didn't work for them for one reason or another. Obviously, we try to minimize that in every way that we can, because when that happens, we spend a bunch of, like, the way that BloomTech is structured, those people, generally speaking, don't pay us anything. So we spend a ton of money and resources and training on those people, and then we don't make anything back. So we're incentivized to minimize those occurrences as much as we can. But I think for a student, that's the fear, right? Like, how do I avoid being somebody who spends a ton of time and effort and energy and money in something with nothing to show for it? So we think really deeply about how we help students avoid that worst case scenario.
But what do you think will the secret be for company building? I mean, apart from education.
There are 87 million things that I've learned along the way. And if I were to, break it down into what I think is the most important, I guess, a little bit counterintuitive, people will argue about whether such a thing as 10x engineers exist. Are there people who are 10 times more impactful to an engineering team than the average person? I think the answer is obviously yes. And engineering salaries are kind of at a watermark, assuming that, there will, like, if you could identify just those 10x engineers and pay them accurately, they might make 3 times what an engineer makes today. And there are some engineers who would make very little, if anything, right? I guess one of my fundamental beliefs is that the delta in a high performing employee or person and a medium, not even talking like low, you should probably fire them, but medium is like so astronomically big that you kind of like average it out and take a bell curve and say, okay, on average, everybody's right here. But the extremes are so extreme. A lot of the secret of who wins in startups boils down to who figures out how to, get those very rare highest performers on their team.
I think this is incredible. Thank you so much for taking the time out for this. And one question that I'd like to end with, and let you go. I mean, into startup VCs and all these things, and there's like 11. What do you think is one fact which would blow 11-year-old mind?
Blow 11-year-old's mind. I think perhaps the craziest. So it's not the craziest, but it's a similar vein of like how extreme if you have actual exponential growth, how extreme it is. If you look at like Y Combinator, right? Y Combinator could probably fund every company that they've ever backed and make a massive profit through like one investment alone. And the crazy thing about Y Combinator is they probably have, 20 or 30 of those investments that could pay for everything Y Combinator has ever done in time forever. So yeah, I think the last stat, I saw it not too long before I joined, so that's what I was thinking of. 10% of Y Combinator companies have become billion-dollar companies, something crazy like that. Like that hit rate is so astronomically absurd. It's kind of beautiful in a way. It makes you think like, what is possible actually? Like how many would-be billion-dollar companies are out there if you just take the right people and apply the right stuff. And a billion-dollar company has so much impact from the lives of their customers to employees, investors. There's so much out there that's left to be done. So, yeah.
That looks appealing. I think that's incredible. Thank you so much for doing this, and that's it from my side. Thank you.
Yeah, as you're getting shot.